Welcome to the Grand Challenges Forum. The month of October is equity and justice. And so I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker for tonight. Our speaker is actually from Houston, Texas. Dr. Leandra Hernandez is an assistant professor of communication studies in the Department of Communication at Utah Valley University. She enjoys teaching health, communication, gender studies, and media studies courses. She utilizes Chicana, feminist, and qualitative approaches to explore Latino cultural health experiences, Latino journalism and media representations, and Latino cultural identities in reproductive justice and gendered violence contexts. She is the co-author of Challenging Reproductive Control and Gendered Violence in the Americas, Intersectionality, Power, and Struggle for Rights. And that is the recipient of the 2018 NCA-FWSD Studies Division Bonnie Ritter Award. She is the co-editor of the Lexington Press book series, Lexington Studies in Health Communication, and the Peter Lane Cultural Media Studies book series. Furthermore, as the chair of the NCA La Raza Caucus and Latino Communication Studies Division, she works to foster the study of Latino communication studies for students and scholars alike. Please help me welcome Dr. Leandra Hernandez.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here with all of you tonight. University of Houston holds a special place in my heart as my dad is an alum and I am as well. I actually got my master's degree in communication from the Jack J. Valenti School of Communication in 2010. So this is all kind of like coming back home. So what I'll be talking about today is social justice and equity through the lens of reproductive justice, particularly when thinking about Latin American women's health in both American and Latin American context, also with a focus on the US-Mexico border. So depending on how much time I have today, I may talk about both case studies, but as you can see here, what I'm going to do is start a little bit by talking about my own positionality and my own approach to thinking about social justice and equity through reproductive justice. I'll also talk a little bit about reproductive justice activism and what that looks like. And the two case studies that I'll likely be toggling between tonight are the news coverage of the Zika virus, which I remember in 2016 when the Zika virus hit, several of us were like, whoa, what is going on? And then now in the age of COVID, Zika seems kind of like a thing of the distant past, but there are several important links that we can think about from a health communication perspective when thinking about what we learned from Zika and what we're still learning about COVID currently. And like I said earlier, the other case study I'll also be talking about a bit today is migrant women's health at the US-Mexico border, particularly as we've kind of seen a trajectory of violence at the border over the last several years. So first and foremost, in terms of who I am and how I approach social justice, equity, and diversity initiatives, in addition to looking at social justice, diversity, and equity in academic spaces, just as a general individual, I also do a lot of work in outdoor context, promoting justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, primarily in Salt Lake City, where I currently live, although right now at this moment, I'm in Houston at my parents' dinner table, as you can see in the pictures behind me. So the whole idea of social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion really does tie through everything that I'm interested in, both personally and professionally. So in addition to looking at it in terms of promoting equity and diversity in outdoor spaces for rock climbers, hikers, and alpinists alike, professionally, I'm really interested in looking at it in health context. So as was mentioned earlier, most of my approaches are rooted in Chicana feminisms. So working with Gloria Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga, and several other very important Chicana feminists that inform my work. In terms of my own generation and identity, I'm 3rd/5th generation Mexican-American or Tejana. So looking at violence at the US-Mexico border does not just impact politically how I see the world, but it also impacts me personally, given that I was born and raised in Texas and spent most of my life here. But I'm also a reproductive justice activist. And before moving to Utah to work at Utah Valley University, I was also very active in working with different reproductive justice organizations in Texas and California. And lastly, if you're wondering why I'm interested in media studies, I actually used to work in news before I started teaching and then fell in love with academia. So also, as was mentioned earlier, reproductive justice for me is encapsulated by several different contexts. So we can think about it in terms of equity, health literacy, and health access when thinking about maternal mortality rates, particularly in the state of Texas. When thinking about which groups are dying at disproportionate rates because of COVID or any other major healthcare concern. But it's also thinking about gendered violence against women and how that is a reproductive justice concern as well. Now, generally, when we think about reproductive choice or reproductive health, particularly in the state of Texas, a lot of the discourses and the debates are dominated by conversations surrounding pro-life, pro-choice, right? And you can even see that in the mass media, you can see that in news headlines, but really, reproductive justice, as I'll be discussing later, is a more inclusive sort of holistic approach to social justice and equity and health context by looking at reproductive health care that women need across the lifespan. So it's not just thinking about healthcare access, health literacy, support, and culturally competent care in prenatal context, but it's also thinking about whether or not women have access to safe healthcare, whether or not women are safe generally, and whether or not they are able to parent and raise families free from governmental or institutional interference or anything else. And that's going to be a critical pivotal point when we get to the case study on the border. So in order to think through social justice and equity in reproductive context, I look at several different forms of media in addition to working with different reproductive justice organizations. So when I think about media, I'm looking not only at media representation, but also news discourses and social media use as well. Now, in communication circles or in communication spheres, health communication has traditionally evolved as a more quantitative or post-positivist approach to thinking about doctor-patient relationships and healthcare institutions. Now, one of the benefits of a reproductive justice framework is that it blends traditional health communication theories, as you can see here, and some of which I've already noted, with feminist theories like intersectionality, Chicana feminisms, and transnational feminisms, all of which interrogate power, hegemony, heteronormativity, and really the role of gender and violence in impacting healthcare experiences. So for the book project I'm talking about today, and then also some of the case studies I'll be talking about that are still currently in the works and evolving, most of my research utilizes a qualitative approach to thinking through social justice through reproductive justice, whether that's autoethnography, in-depth interviews, ethnography when working with activists, when working with community members, but it also looks at the role of the news as well. And the reason I blend these two areas is because ultimately, fundamentally, I'm interested in thinking through reproductive justice from a socio-ecological standpoint. Or in other words, instead of just doing interviews or just looking at the media, what I've spent ultimately the last 5 years working on is trying to piece together what a lot of different areas are saying about this topic. So that way we can get a more holistic, a more complete snapshot of what's going on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some of the case studies I'll be discussing today look at the Zika virus and current trends and issues at the US-Mexico border. Now, my first book, which is shown here on this slide, was my first formal academic entry to or foray into reproductive justice. And it was co-authored with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah de los Santos Upton, who teaches at the University of Texas in El Paso. Now, this book specifically had several different case studies that at that moment kind of provided a snapshot of some of the reproductive justice trends that were currently going on at that point in time. So we were mostly working on this book between 2015 and 2018 when it came out. And now Sarah and I are working on our next book project, which is kind of like a part 2, but is more so looking at reproductive justice in national and international context, particularly when thinking about how social justice, equity, and reproductive justice are being impacted politically by our current presidential administration and a lot of the political debates and legislation that we're seeing at the moment. So in this book, some of the case studies that we included, as you can see here, were first pro-choice, pro-life debates and the news, particularly in the state of Texas. We also looked at reproductive feminicides, or as I'll be referring to it later, reproductive feminicidios in the United States and Latin America. And then we looked at reproductive injustices, both through the context of the Zika virus in Venezuela, and then also some of the violence in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. So I, of course, don't have enough time to talk about all of them. But what I want to do first is just kind of talk a little bit about what reproductive justice is, and then we'll dive into our case studies and look at reproductive violence against women. So as you can see here on the slide, there are 2 really important historical posters that, for me, kind of encapsulate the decades-long effort that we are seeing here for reproductive justice for women, but essentially really for women of color, which is where reproductive justice comes from. It's where reproductive justice finds its origins. So on the left, you'll see a poster that says, "Raise your voice, shout out against the war on women." Again, it's a lot of the same rhetoric that we've been seeing for the last several decades. But the one on the right, it says, "Stop forced sterilization." And throughout this presentation, one of the things that I'll be doing is historicizing violence on the border that we're seeing now within, ultimately, our country's reproductive eugenics history, right? So in other words, what we're seeing going on right now at the US-Mexico border and the ways in which women are being treated, the ways in which they are being sterilized, the violence that we're seeing is not by any means a novel occurrence, but rather is just one domino in a larger pattern of reproductive injustices. So what I want you to do real quick is check out some of these headlines on this slide. And the reason I put them here was not just for an attention getter, but rather some of these headlines that you can see here were some of the few that ultimately inspired me to even work on this trajectory of research in the first place. So the first one, rape victims must notify their rapist before getting an abortion in Arkansas. Second one, we're seeing the discourse and the language on the war over reproductive rights. The third one, abortion surge in Texas after Planned Parenthood is defunded. We also see a headline about Texas and the maternal mortality rate, particularly for women of color. But the last 2 focus on transnational or Latin American context, with one, El Salvador's advice on the Zika virus, don't have babies. And the last one, pregnant women are the latest victims of Mexico's femicide crisis. Now, taken together here, between the years 2015 and 2018, worldwide, there were several trends going on that were really bringing reproductive justice to the forefront, not only in the mass media, but in popular culture as well. So we were starting to see the Ni Una Más movement, or Ni Una Menos, meaning we're starting to see anti-femicide activists in Latin America and also in Ireland and in several other places really raising up against violence against women and murder against women. But these 2 headlines in specific highlight the reproductive angle of such justice, of such efforts, of such activism. And at this point in time, the reproductive component of this larger set of violences against women hadn't been fully developed. So this is why Sarah and I were really interested in thinking through what reproductive feminicides looked like. Now, to give you an idea of where we started, femicide or feminicide, or in Spanish, it's feminicidio. Feminicide was a term specifically that was developed by Mexican and Latin American feminists. Now, first and foremost, we had the term femicide, but in Spanish, feminicidio really highlighted the murdering of women and the violence against women that was rooted in particular like misogynistic cultural context. So if any of you followed the maquiladoras or the violence against women at the US-Mexico border, particularly from a labor perspective, in the 1990s and the 2000s, this is when we started to see these stories come to light. And we're also still seeing this issue now, particularly with the desaparecidas, or those who have disappeared. Now, Dr. Nina Lozano has a wonderful video. If you just search for her on YouTube, you'll find videos and work that she's done with activists both in the US and Mexico that are trying to help women find their children, find their sisters, find their tias. And what we're seeing here is that this is a larger, really human rights conundrum and catastrophe. When women are disappearing, they're going missing, they're being murdered, their remains are being found, and ultimately several police forces and the state are not doing anything for retribution for the families or the victims. So we have feminicide, which is this larger umbrella term that encapsulates the murdering of women, violence against women, particularly because of their gender. And again, this is all, of course, rooted in issues of like power and oppression. However, there wasn't really something that focused on reproductive violence against women. And the headline from the prior slide that focused on the murdering of pregnant women, or if we think about women being sterilized against their will, this is all part of a larger sort of reproductive feminicide trajectory that Sarah and I have essentially been tracking over the last several years. So as you can see here on the right in this slide, Monares Fragoso and her colleagues came up with a typology of violence against women: child feminicide, intimate partner, familial, and systematic. But reproductive feminicide wasn't really on the radar. So Sarah and I sought to explore, at least at that point in time, what did this violence look like? And ultimately, the reason it's so fundamentally important is because of the ways in which we have human rights violations, right? If we're thinking about agency and free will and power in health context, one of the most ultimate violations of human rights and human freedoms is forced sterilization, right? Or the opportunity to take away the right from a woman to be a mother if that is what she wants. That is reproductive injustice violation 101. And as you can see here in the slide, there are two pictures from two different news articles. One, an image of a mother on the left who was sterilized without her consent. And then on the right, there's a sterilization procedure going on in Venezuela. Now, I want to preface this by saying that, as I'll talk about in a few slides, the Venezuelan context is interesting because if I had to phrase it, the sterilizations were in/voluntary, meaning women at this point in time, I want to say around 2016, were undergoing sterilizations willingly, but they were doing so because a host of larger factors ultimately left them with no choice. So the idea here is not that women were voluntarily undergoing sterilizations because they wanted to, but rather because of poverty, food shortages, government corruption, and more. They felt like they had no other option because birth control and abortion were not accessible and also not legal. So from a health equity, from a social justice perspective, we can see how systematically there are several different factors here that are creating a context where women felt like they had no other option. And that is another example of a reproductive injustice. Now, in this image, from an article written by Ulmer, you can see two Venezuelan women looking down at their abdomens in a post-sterilization procedure recovery period. Now, one of the things that I thought was particularly beautiful about this article, or about this image in particular, are some of the icons and the images in the back and some of the bright colors that contrast with this sort of notion of a sterilization procedure that was voluntary, but if you're operating with a very limited set of choices, is the decision to undergo that procedure really voluntary? And from a health equity, reproductive justice framework, that was one of the questions that Sarah and I were grappling with. Also in this image, you can see here, several women that were undergoing preparation for the sterilization procedure in Venezuela. And this is one of the case studies that we discuss in the book as well. But again, that's another question that I would like for you all to consider moving forward, right? What is the role of choice, of free will, and of agency, particularly when we're thinking about a procedure that is unlikely to be reversed? Now, one of the things that I also thought was noteworthy in several of these articles that Sarah and I analyzed is that several of these journalists who interviewed women throughout Venezuela, some of the women were under the impression that the sterilization could be reversed. Other women had shared in their interviews that they weren't entirely sure what the entire procedure meant or what it looked like, but they just knew that they were unable to take care of more children or support more children. And some of the other articles that we read said that there was a wait list of up to 500 women who needed a sterilization procedure. So ultimately, the way that Sarah and I are conceptualizing it is from a feminicide perspective, particularly with violence against women. Reproductive feminicide is a spectrum. So we're seeing here the notion of an in/voluntary sterilization procedure, one of which is available to women because other options like pills or abortions are not accessible. And then we also have the very extreme end on this spectrum, like in the case of Mexico, where pregnant women were being murdered for a variety of different reasons. So back at that point, between 2015 and 2018, we had those case studies, but now one of the ones that has been occupying several news headlines, but also our own psyche, is the violence that is going on at our border currently. So I'm going to jump ahead to that real quick because I don't have enough time to talk about the other one. But I can't remember when exactly this image came out. But if you haven't seen anything about what's going on at the US-Mexico border, you may have seen this image of this young girl crying. And I remember as a former news editor and as someone who tracks the news pretty frequently, I remember seeing this image and seeing delusions of conversations on social media and then also in other discourses coming out about this young girl who at this moment, when this image came out and when this article came out, she kind of became the face at that point in time of reproductive violence at the US-Mexico border. And also more particularly, when we think here about migrant rights violations at the US-Mexico border, particularly in our current time frame, there have been a range of human rights violations. And I put the Trump administration in there basically as a timepost or a signifier, right? Sarah and I have also written extensively on the Obama administration and deportation and things of that nature. So this is less about politics, but more so about what has transpired in the last few years. So as you can see here on the slide, there have been, of course, detention centers. That's been one of the longest running trends that we've seen. There have also been reports of migrant children that have been physically and sexually abused, migrant women and men that have been abused. But also one of the most concerning points, in addition to all of this, is that there isn't really a very clear understanding of just what numbers or percentages we're working here for several different reasons. Reporting concerns, individuals not coming through because they are obviously probably scared or threatened. And in addition to these concerns, we also have several more, as you can see here, and I'm not going to read it all, but Hernandez wrote an article in 2019 that I think really encapsulated some of the human rights violations we're seeing at the border from a human rights perspective. So there's sexual assault, and Hernandez phrased it as an inescapable component of the collective migrant rights journey. And I thought that was pressing and important for us to think about, particularly because of the tenuous nature of the migrant journey to the United States. If we're thinking about sexual violence being an inescapable component, then I think that really truly highlights here some of the horrors and the atrocities that are experienced not only on the journey, but also upon arrival at the border as well. Now, furthermore, reproductively, there have also been several news reports that have come out that have talked about the tracking of migrant women's periods, stillbirths and miscarriages at the border, transferring of children to the foster care without plans for reunification. And ultimately, we're still seeing conversations in the news and politically and legislatively about what these reunification plans look like, if at all. Now, some of the other headlines that I literally just pulled in the last few days focus on recent reports that came out in September last month about how women at the US-Mexico border were being sterilized, which is, again, another human rights violation, another violation of reproductive justice tenets, principles, and practices. So one article headline said, a whistleblower complaint alleging hysterectomies performed on women recalls the ugly history of forced sterilization. Also, forced sterilization of Mexican Americans when US lawmakers took a page from the Nazi playbook. So there's very strong rhetoric and very strong historicizing in that headline. But then lastly, very similar to the third one, allegations of forced sterilizations and ICE detention evoke a long legacy of eugenics in the United States. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this topic specifically is because what we're seeing right now, as I mentioned earlier, is one domino in the larger strand of our country's history. And I remember when I spoke to our wonderful facilitators and coordinators, and they said, you know, the topic is social justice and equity. The sky's the limit with what you wanted to talk about. I immediately knew I had to talk about this because this is a human rights violation 101. Now, from a historical perspective, reproductive injustice is no shock or no concern really when we think about our larger country's trajectory when it comes to eugenics and sterilization. If you haven't seen the documentary No Más Bebés, for example, I suggest that you check it out because it chronicles the experiences of Mexican origin women who were sterilized in LA in the early 1970s. And several of those women were American citizens too. So if the concern of citizenship was ever on your mind, I mean, it happens to citizens and non-citizens alike. There are also large histories of the sterilization of Native American women. There are histories of birth control and population control with Puerto Rican women. And if we're thinking about even the history of gynecology and J. Marion Sims, who is known by many to be the father of modern gynecology, most of what we understand as gynecological history was done on Black women slaves against their will. So, you know, when we think about what's going on right now at the border, it is absolutely atrocious from a human rights violation perspective. But I think it is perhaps less surprising when we think about it as one part of a larger historical trajectory. So together, most of the research that Dr. De Los Santos Upton and I work on utilizes three fundamental pillars or frameworks to think through migrant violations at the US-Mexico border. The first is reproductive justice, which I've been discussing quite a bit. The second one is social justice linked with reproductive justice. And the third one is intersectionality. So reproductive justice is a framework, as I mentioned earlier, that is ultimately rooted in Black feminisms. Now, reproductive justice argues that such justice and such equity can only be achieved when equitable healthcare is a reality for women of all backgrounds. Now, we're thinking here of identity categories broadly, women of all races, all genders, all class statuses, so on and so forth. And if you do a cursory search of maternal mortality rates, of COVID deaths and the like, you will see the disproportionate communities, particularly women of color, that are impacted by several different health concerns, diseases, viruses, and illnesses. So ultimately, like at a fundamental level, we cannot have reproductive justice unless there is health equity, health access, and more. Now, reproductive justice also kind of enlarges the pro-life, pro-choice binary by providing support for women who do or do not choose to have children, for women who choose to have several children, and also, as you can see here in the second point, the right to carry, birth, and raise children in safe cities free from toxic environmental or governmental pollutants. And this is critical, particularly right now when we think about health disparities, health literacy levels, and more. Now, particularly when we're thinking about the US-Mexico border, we can see how detention centers, inability to social distance, inadequate healthcare, and more are creating an unjust health context for women, some of whom have been there for a very long time. Now, the second one that I wanted to talk about looks at intersectionality. And intersectionality is rooted in Black feminisms and critical race theory, which looks at how different identity categories ultimately shape our experiences. And as you can see here on the slide, I have a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, who was one of the first feminists to ultimately kind of coin this term and engage with it. And intersectionality highlights how social movement, organization, and advocacy can really highlight not only the violence against women, but also what can be done to combat it. And it's really looking at power relations and what are the different factors that impact and facilitate lopsided power relations. So if we think about our own intersectionality, right? If you think about it as an intersection like that, what sorts of identity categories come to mind for you and your own experiences and your own backgrounds? What are some of the identity categories that are most salient or most relevant? Is it race, gender, class, sexuality, perhaps something else, and so on and so forth? And when we start overlapping and overlayering our different identity categories, that's when we can see what's at play here, particularly when thinking about violence context. So as I near the end of my presentation, one of the things that I wanted to do was just share with you a few ideas of not only how motherhood is a political act, but also some strategies that can be used broadly from a social justice perspective. And for me, as a social justice educator, a social justice researcher, a social justice advocate, the question always comes down to, what are some of the micro practices that I can engage in to help make the world a better place? So some of the organizations that I'll talk about right now include Angry Tias and Abuelas of the Rio Grande Valley. That's one. And I'll also talk about California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. Now, two organizations that Sarah and I have worked with that have done a beautiful job really stepping forward and doing what they can in times of need. Now, Angry Tias and Abuelas, which translated as angry aunts and angry grandmas, which I love so much, provides humanitarian aid to migrants at the border. Now, their services include, but are not limited to, providing food, water, diapers, sanitary napkins, but also helping migrants look at bus routes, talking to them about border checkpoints, and also sharing information with them. And I think the information component here is especially critical and especially crucial when thinking about how the US-Mexico border can be a place that is shrouded with uncertainty. And also with California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, they did so much for their communities that didn't just look at reproductive, prenatal, or postnatal care, but also voting, education, transportation to work, transportation to healthcare, and so on and so forth. So as we wind down, I wanted to re-emphasize the notion that ultimately what we're working with here is a spectrum of reproductive justice and equity that includes small, everyday micro practices, also larger scale activist efforts, all of which are interconnected, particularly when we think about how in our current pandemic, we don't all have the time or the resources or even the physical capabilities to go out and protest all the time. So some of the steps that I have here are, like I said earlier, provided more broadly, right? Just to kind of think through in terms of what can be done to help those who might need it. So one option is to support birthing centers and organizations that provide care that is culturally appropriate and empowering. You could also consider supporting a local organization to help those in need, which really helps to highlight the community engagement and the role of coalitions. You could also perhaps donate items, or something that is easy that we can all do is share accurate information. And as a former news editor, but also a communication researcher, we know now that fake news is part of our permanent lexicon. And it takes a little bit of extra time and effort to vet all the information and to really engage in information literacy. But that is crucial, particularly when it comes to informing others about what is going on and what can be done. And then also, for those who might be interested in going into research capacities or capabilities, you could also considering utilizing culturally informed and culturally knowledgeable research methods, which I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. So ultimately, as I noted earlier, I approach social justice and equity through a reproductive justice framework and have spent many, many days and months over the last 5 to 6 years kind of tracking and exploring current reproductive justice trends, not only to get an idea of what we're seeing, but also to get an idea of how we can help those in need moving forward. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing right now. And then, yeah, I look forward to questions and chatting.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hernandez. We will open the floor up, and I have the unmuting happening. So I hope that means that someone has a question. Does someone have a question for Dr. Hernandez?
Or even just comments.
Well, so I'll wait. You guys can think about your questions. What's interesting is that my students brought this, the story about the women on the border being forced to have hysterectomies, and I did not believe. I was like, no, let me make sure I go and read this and check the sources, etc., because I can't believe that that is happening. And so, what do you know about any efforts to combat this? It just seems like it's an obvious, like you said, this is not new. We've been here before, and I think it was made clear that that's, illegal and inhumane and, all of the different. So are there any organizations, lawsuits, like what's being done about that?
Yeah, so I don't know of any lawsuits immediately off the top of my head, but I have seen that there are several reproductive justice organizations in El Paso, and also several pro bono lawyers who are working to help as they can with the information that they have. I've also been tracking information online about how a lot of individuals were undergoing efforts to protect the whistleblower, who is a Black woman. And even then, from an intersectionality perspective, you can see how brave she was when she came forward, how she was very concerned about what could happen to her. But there's also other concerns about the safety of the organizations and the individuals helping out as well. So it's a bit hard to answer, but so Sarah, for example, my colleague who lives in UT or teaches at UT El Paso and lives in El Paso, has spoken to several of the doulas and the midwives who work in those areas who have tried to provide care, and they're also finding a really hard time kind of navigating those spaces with the detention centers and social distancing, border patrol and the like. So there's a lot of different factors going on right now that make it really challenging.
I do have a question. Thank you for speaking first off, but What are your thoughts on the employment providing birth control and how that relates to just improper reproductive justice for women in America?
Yeah, so birth control has a really interesting history in the United States as well. So if we think, I'm going to try to answer this succinctly, but if we think about it, historically, particularly with second wave feminism, which is really when we started to see the pro-life, pro-choice debates come out, especially rooted in like activist marches and things of that nature. The birth control pill was like one of the linchpins of second wave feminism. And I think a lot of the larger cultural assumptions about the birth control pill is that every woman wants it, having birth control is reproductive justice, and that's kind of a closed book, end of story. And some activists believe that, and rightfully so. But birth control has a tenuous history, particularly as it has been used on and tested on women of color and populations of color without their consent. So on the one hand, while the birth control pill has been seen as a major advancement for women's rights and family planning, several other activists look at it as another means of population control, particularly when we think about eugenics in the early 1900s as well. And also, to build on that point, it raises a really interesting question for me personally, as I teach at Utah Valley University, a university that is over 80% white and over 80% identified with the LDS faith. Now, I have conversations with my students about this all the time, right? Should organizations provide birth control? And what is the role of it, whether it's a religious organization or not? And I don't really think it's a one size fits all sort of response. But again, I do think it's important to think about how the history of the birth control pill hasn't always been sunshine and rainbows.
Hi, I really liked how you mentioned the thing about sharing accurate information and the role that plays in like the fight against reproductive injustice and everything else that you were talking about. And so I wanted to ask, so I know that definitely we see that in the media today, but what are some specific ways that like we contribute to that in general, like in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I think it's so, I don't want to say easy, but it's more easily facilitated, I think, right now with political polarization and just how easy it is to click the share button, right? And one of the technological advances I've seen on Facebook that I thought was really interesting in the last few months is how there will be fact checkers on the bottom of memes or the bottom of news articles that say, this article is partially correct, this article is fully correct, or it's totally incorrect. And I have these conversations with my students all the time, right? Even something as simple as Googling the board of directors for a particular news outlet, or looking at perhaps a news outlet ideological stance or things of that nature to help you get an idea of what the background is of the organization before sharing it, because that also helps us understand, I think, the frame of mind that perhaps a particular article was written in. And the reason I also bring that up is because journalistically speaking, journalists do their best when it comes, for the most part, to being objective and to writing the story the best they can. But it's also important to keep in mind that journalists are part of a larger journalistic system here, where the articles are often vetted by, if we're thinking about it from a TV news perspective, they're vetted by assistant producers, news directors, and the like. So there's always going to be a little bit of a push and pull there too. And yeah, ultimately I would say, don't be so quick to share. Check out where it's coming from first, because I've seen several individuals, very educated academically, who perhaps might not know a website like The Onion is satire, and then they share it thinking it's accurate. And it's not necessarily The Onion, right? It could be a similar satire website. But yeah, taking a few minutes to research the organization will go a long way. So Bridget says, I had no idea that birth control was illegal in some areas. Is it something that's really common? Yes, particularly throughout Latin America. And even if you just do a cursory Google search of in illegal Latin America, you'll find several really interesting graphics that show the degrees to which birth control might be legal, but abortion might be illegal, or perhaps like early term abortion is legal, but not late term. There are also several countries where birth control and abortion are both totally illegal. And that's one of the reasons that Venezuela was an important case study in 2016, because of several of these illegalities that are rooted in larger cultural context shaped by the Catholic Church. And I didn't get to talk about it earlier, but one of the things that was really interesting at that point in time when the Zika virus came out is that the Pope came out and said, like, we should allow individuals to use birth control to prevent the transmission of the Zika virus, to prevent microcephaly and Guillain-Barré syndrome and things of that nature. But you never saw the Pope at any point in time come out and make a certain sort of similar admonition for HIV/AIDS prevention or anything else. So it's really pressing to think about it in a Latin American context, because there we're not just dealing with political organizations and governments, but we're also thinking about the influence of the Catholic Church as well.
All right, if there aren't any other questions, let's you can unmute now. Those of you, some people were unmute, and we can give Dr. Hernandez a round of applause.
Excuse me, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
I thought it was very true and interesting how you mentioned that power dynamics plays a large role in gender violence. So I was wondering, what are some ways that you can maybe raise your children, or like just help people who feel the need to take power from others, if that makes sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Trinity, that's a great question. I have thought about this a lot as a Mexican-American woman who researches machismo, right? And for those of you who identify as Hispanic, Latino, or know individuals who are, you know that like the machismo sort of gender role identity, while fleeting generationally, is still there. And, you know, it really comes down to having these hard conversations, compassionate, constructive conversations with our loved ones. When I think about my nieces and my nephews and my family members at very early ages, it's even something as small as teaching a young one not to value a female family member or a woman family member because they're your sister, your mother, your tia, your cousin. It's to identify them as an individual who is worthy of being respected, right? It can also include conversations about inclusivity and compassion, in terms of talking to younger individuals, especially men, about how it's okay to have emotions and to process their emotions healthily. Because, you know, when we think about gender violence, feminicidios, and all of these different factors, I mean, of course, they're operating at micro levels between individuals, but they're also representational extensions of larger like systems of sexism and misogyny and cultural powers and imbalances. So yeah, something small from a micro practice could even be having those conversations about valuing women for who they are, not in relation to an individual or who they may be. And I think really stressing the importance of supporting men and their emotions and their needs for empathy and caring as well.
All right, very good, thank you. And very nice, very good question. Okay, any other questions?
Can I ask one last question?
Yes.
How would you suggest navigating social media and using it to obtain information, but also if you'd like to share information? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to finding those organizations and researching them, right? So several of the organizations that I follow on social media are culturally based grassroots organizations. Like I talked a little bit about Angry Tias, Angry Abuelas. I talked a little bit about California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. But if that's something that you're interested in, you could even look at like reproductive justice organization for a particular community, or even just more broadly. There's also like the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. And those are most of the ones that I follow in conjunction with news outlets and organizations from all sides of the spectrum. So that way, as a news consumer and a social media consumer, you can kind of get the balanced, holistic diet, right? And you can get a sense of who's saying what. And then that way you can really come to making your own informed decisions about any particular topic. I really just like following several of the grassroots organizations to see the research that they're putting forth and a lot of the initiatives that they're doing in local communities to see if there are any that you could potentially help out with as well, if you were so inclined.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leandra H. Hernandez. Thank you for a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you all for having me. I had a wonderful time.
All right, thank you, and have a safe trip back to Utah.
Thank you. Y'all have a good one.
All right, have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.